is our guest today, presenting a lecture on his life, followed by your questions to him, and then to the presenter. It is my honor to introduce you to Dr. Benjamin Franklin.
Good citizens, I thank you so much for such a warm and welcoming welcome. It is a delight to be here, but at my age, well over 300, it's a delight to be anywhere. I thank you all for braving the cold weather. These great plains of yours are lands that I never knew about. We knew approximately how wide the country was because of the voyage of Cook and others who gave us the ability to know the width, but we had no idea what was on the internal of this country. We did not know, for example, the extent of the plains or the height of the Rocky Mountains. Mr. Jefferson, a man I think you know because he's carved into one of the rocks on the western side of your state. Mr. Jefferson assumed that the eastern coast would slide up to the Alleghenies and then come down to, perchance, a great plain of some sort, and then there'd be another Allegheny and then gently down into a west coast to match the east coast. As was found out a bit after my time, with the voyage of discovery of Lewis and Clark, the Rocky Mountains somewhat defy the idea of the Allegheny balance upon the eastern seaboard, and they found it was, of course, much more difficult to cross than they had anticipated. But they persevered. They climbed, they stood, they stepped repeatedly, and in a voyage beyond all reason, they reached the other side. And I think at that time they have a bit of a parallel between mine and yours. For indeed, there is much difference between my time and yours. We lived in a 5-mile-an-hour world at the most, and that's on a good horse. We lived in a time when a letter could take a day or two to stretch about a few miles. Indeed, sometimes when I was in France as ambassador to the court of Louis, it would take 3, 6, or even 9 months to get a letter back. You now have instant communication. You now have almost universal access to all knowledge of the past. You have, with your machines, you can translate the ancient texts immediately. I had to struggle a bit more with it. And yet, despite these differences, it is obvious to me that there is so much the same. So much of the trials that we face. We had issues with public health. We dealt with dilemmas of what to do between people of different religions and ethnicities, of different backgrounds. The ability to vote, and if our overseers, the government above us, was truly listening to our ideas, and if we were indeed a community at all, or simply a thrown-together mob. Well, the arguments continued. Those in my Congress yelled and shouted at one another, called each other by interesting terminology, declared one person was a traitor or another one was only in it for the money. So yes, you see, much the same. But we here today, as I stand before you, also share some of the same vision. The great breadth of this country, which your Lewis and Clark discovered, somewhat parallels the great breadth of discovery that you are taking from the humble beginnings that we gave, with but a few millions, all crowded within really a few dozen miles of the Eastern Ocean, to now you stand some 100 millions, and you have conquered so much. Well, one thing I didn't want to be was a candle dipper. And so I chafed at home, doing these simple errands and cutting wicks. My intellect, as poor as it is not made to be happy with cutting wicks. So my father took me around the town to various trades. The chandlers, as he was, a candle maker, a cordwainer, that of those who make shoes, glaziers, those who work with glass, and carpentry, And I learned some of those trades in my trial, which served me very well as I grew. But my father finally realized that what I should do was work in something that had to do with writing and reading. Now, I cannot remember a time when I could not read. From the age of 3 onward, I read everything I could. I read through my father's humble library of some polemic books and some articles and preachings that my uncle Benjamin, for whom I'm named, wrote out for me. And also books of Plutarch's Lives and Ovid and Cicero in translation before I could really master, if I ever did, the Greek and the Latin. But my brother James, having recently returned from England, was setting up in Boston one of the first print shops of that town. And he was producing a newspaper and was want of a hand. And so my father put me into indentured servitude to my elder brother for a certain period of years, where I would be working for him from approximately 12 to 21, and learning the trade of print shop. Now, I don't know how many of you have ever had to work for your older brother, but it can be sometimes a very marvelous experience, full of respect and cheer, where you share family bonds, or so I'm told. James and I did not agree often, except at the disagreeable state of our local governance, and we took great pleasure in rubbing them the wrong way on many of their decisions. But between he and I, there stood great enmity. The church bells are ringing early. Say hello for me. But between us, there shared great enmity. He didn't like my cheeky attitude. I soon surpassed him both in speed and accuracy in my composition. My writing soon surpassed his own. Matter of fact, I wrote 13 silence do-good letters, disguising my hand, pretending to be a 40-year-old country widow woman. But here I was, but a young man barely in his teens, sliding those letters underneath the door at night, and he, not knowing who authored them, printed them in his paper, much to the approbation, that is to say, the approval of his friends, who tried to guess who this writer could be. Now imagine, here I was setting type for the next day's print, and hearing my work praised by my brother's friends, and all sorts of manners of distinguished notables of our town being named as the possible author. Well, I eventually discovered myself to my brother, which means to show, reveal the identity, and his friends had a great big laugh at it. My brother was not so well amused, and let me know the feeling of his displeasure. Perchance this is where I developed my great distaste of arbitrary use of power. But it soon fell out that I could not withstand this treatment, and so I did something which I do not recommend to any of you young people. Your older people can make your own decision on this. But I ran away from home. I ran away from his home. And I went to New York. And then, no work being there, I went to Philadelphia. Now, Philadelphia is a marvelous town, well planned out by William Penn, Pennsylvania is the name. And William Penn established a very ordered city with square streets. I began to make my mark. I took a job with one Keimer, a rather disordered printer of the town, and set his shop to good order, and soon became basically his foreman. Now, in my time, letter writing was an art. We didn't have, where our texting was done with quill and ink, and you had to carefully compose your letters. And I had trained myself to be a writer by copying and then rearranging or translating from prose to poetry, and later from that poetry to prose, the best writing that I could find, The Spectator for one magazine sent over from England. And I had acquired a good talent, a good hand of expression, some felicity of expression, as Mr. Adams said to Mr. Jefferson later. And my letters, and this was, nowadays, if you wrote me a letter, if I were to show it to my friends, you might be rather shocked at this corruption of certain common courtesy and privacy. But in my time, this was done. This was a piece of entertainment. So you wrote your letter knowing that it would be shared amongst friends, and people might even copy it by hand, certain sections. that would be particularly engaging, or a certain bit of news, and they would be printed in newspapers for others to read. And I was a young man in the center of civilization, London, the great heart of my empire. For remember, at this time, I was a very loyal British citizen. I loved King George and all the royal family. Parliament was a beacon of reason and law and justice, and all of Britain's great culture was mine to share. And for 18 months, I labored there, improving my craft, learning my trade, and missing home a bit. I became a swimming instructor, amongst other things, because I did love to swim. But after time, Denham offered me a chance to return home. Now, I did miss Philadelphia. And I had sort of a fiancée in Philadelphia, one Deborah Reed, who I had sort of engaged myself to before I left. But her friends, in my long absence, even though I had written her once in all that time, had determined that I was not returning, and so convinced her to marry one John Rogers, a potter, who was a rotter, as it turned out. Mr. Rogers, you see, may have been married before without the benefit of divorce or construction, and there was no way to get an iron rod that far into the air. And so I loved kite flying. I had since I was a young boy. I used to lie in the mill ponds and let out a kite and let it pull me across the water. A very simple instrument. I realized as I looked at problems, I looked not at the whole problem, but them in their parts. If ever you look at any of my inventions, bifocals or mapping the Gulf Stream, etc., all these things come about by taking the problem apart, looking at the various elements, and then placing new information in them one at a time, and voila, you see all of a sudden a chance solution. I needed an iron needle, an iron rod in the sky. It would be easiest to put it on a tall building. No tall building exists. I still need a needle in the sky. I don't need it attached to a building. That's the piece that can be supplanted with something else. How else do you get a needle into the sky? What can possibly go into the sky? A bird. They're not too happy about being tied. What about a kite flies in the sky? Removing the building, submitting the kite into the equation, and you have the solution. Now, many of you have expressed great concern. Oh, Dr. Franklin, you risked your life for our benefit. How courageous of you. And I must thank you for that kind compliment and tell you the full story. I took many precautions. We knew something about insulation. And I was standing upon a large block of wax. There was a hemp line attached to a silk cord, silk being an insulator. And the final thing that I did to ensure my safety was I handed the kite string to my son. He was smart. We're filling our land with pilgrims on a different sort of pilgrimage than the original pilgrims, but people wanting to find a new hope, a new way of living. But they were also emptying their jails into America and sending over thieves and murderers and brigands of all sorts. I suggested we repay the favor by sending England back something native to America. Rattlesnakes. Rattlesnakes are better than thieves, for thieves give you no warning before striking, and rattlesnakes do. There are 13 rattles in a rattlesnake's tail and 13 colonies. Seems fitting. But Britain never would recognize us as fully British citizens, but they taxed us like British citizens. But it was never the tax. It was never the tax that drove us to eventually what we were driven. 1775, 1776, I left England. I thought forever. Come back home, that I would simply retire from public life, attend to my experiments, and then disappear. But I returned to Philadelphia, and they praised me. The people of Philadelphia met my boat with cannon fire, parade, with gunfire, and cheers and bells ringing in the steeples. They knew I had tried hard, and even though failing, were willing to take up the other half. If they do not wish to respect us as British, then we shall respect ourselves as Americans. Franklin, the word Franklin means freeman. And my family's trade, besides the silk dyeing and the candle making that it developed into, was traditionally that of a blacksmith. Those who create from metal something more. And if you know something about blacksmithing, you take a very crude and rough metal, iron ore, and by heat and hammering, you transform it into something different, something that wasn't there before, of much tougher materials, iron, steel, but something like what happens in the forge happened to me. I went in that room as a loyal British citizen, which I had been for 70 years, and left un-American. I cried for the loss of what could have been. But as you may recall, I was not left alone when I returned to Philadelphia. I was assigned as a representative to the Second Continental Congress, and there was put on a committee with Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, Mr. Livingston, and others to draft the Declaration of Independence. The Declaration I had some small hand in. For example, Mr. Jefferson's first draft was, "We hold these truths to be sacred and undeniable." And I changed it to self-evident, thinking it would be a little bit less charged with the holy and make it more manward for mankind. And a few other things. A full fourth of the Declaration that Mr.